Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are we getting on? Welcome to a brand new Starfield video. So, we've had a new interview with Todd Howard come out in the last couple of days that is humongous, would be a good word. And obviously, there is a few little snippets about Starfield and some information that we have not had before, which is very, very cool. So, let's jump in and have a chat about this. Okay, yeah, so Todd Howard joined Lex Fridman on his podcast on YouTube in the last couple of days, which was very, very cool. This is one heck of a big conversation, and as you can imagine, it touched on a lot of things other than just Starfield. There's a little bit of Fallout in there, there's a lot of Skyrim chatter in there, there's a little bit of Elder Scrolls 6, there's a lot of older Bethesda game stuff in there, going all the way back to the 90s, actually, in some of these conversations. It's massive. The podcast is very, very nearly 3 hours long, so if you want a really deep dive into Bethesda and Todd Howard and what goes on and their attitudes and sort of how they think about game development, stuff like that, it's an amazing thing for that. It's also got timestamps on it, so you can kind of break down the bits that you're particularly interested in, but it's a conversation, there's a kind of flow to it, so worth kind of going through the whole thing, I think, really. We'll link that down below if you want to check it out, definitely worth having a look at, so that's very, very cool. The Starfield bit is relatively contained. There's not a whole lot of stuff that is entirely new. There's a few things that are new. There's a few things that we could have kind of guessed at that are now confirmed, which is cool. And some interesting conversations, a lot about the mindset and the experience, which is really cool. So I'm going to kind of go through this more or less in the order it is in the interview, and we'll see what we've got. So one of the first things we were talking about was in-game AI and the changes they're making to that. So not particularly surprising that they would move things on over previous games. That's the general way that things are done. And they're aiming for greater reactivity with the player rather than having particularly NPCs and stuff being signposts. So you want your NPCs to respond to what you are doing, have done, will be doing, stuff like that. If you look at Fallout 76, when you're running around that game, this is a very early version of this, I suppose, then you can walk past an NPC, particularly somewhere like the major settlements, and they might go, hey, I recognise you. You did this big thing in terms of gameplay and story and things like that. So they will go, hey, you're the guy who did that. You're the guy, or whatever. That obviously is a reaction to what you've done, and they're building from that into something more involved, which is really, really cool to hear. So it's an effort to make things more realistic, and particularly focusing on relationships with characters. Obviously, there is a limit to just how dynamic and how much of that you can get into a relationship, but they're aiming to make that more reactive, more realistic, which is really cool. Apparently, 4 of the companions in particular, there are more than 4 companions. Basically, we can infer that from the fact he's specified that a particular subset of them in this interview are what he's talking about. But 4 of them in particular, you can build up relationships with. You probably can do this with more characters than just the 4, but these 4 have a particularly reactive type of relationship, wherein they will respond to what you do. Now, in previous games, as Todd pointed out here, if you do stuff they don't like, your relationship kind of drifts apart and you just no longer, say, couple, if you're having a romantic relationship with that character, they will no longer have that relationship with you, they'll be away. And it's just kind of a sliding scale and not hugely realistic. In this case, they're going for more of they'll react to what you do, but depending on what it is, I would assume, they won't necessarily just stop having a relationship with you, you know? So you might go out, you do something, it upsets your companion that you have a close friendship with, a romantic relationship with, whatever it might be, and they will react to that, and they will be angry at you, they will be pissed off, they will not talk to you maybe, I don't know, but something to that effect for a while until they get over it, you know? They kind of, it blows over. Much like a real relationship, you know, you finish work, you go out for a beer with your mates after work, and don't stagger in till 11 o'clock at night, there's a very good chance the wife might be angry. It's that kind of vibe, you know, obviously not exactly the same, but that's the kind of vibe that I'm getting from this, from what Todd has said, so that's really cool, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Interestingly, it doesn't apply to all characters and all companions. Now, one example I suspect that it won't apply to is Vasco, who is basically the only companion we know about at this point. He's the robot, we've seen him in a lot of their promotional stuff, looks very cool, he has a personality, he has a character, you can get to know him, but I can't see a robot's personality reacting along those lines. It seems like moral judgments would be less a part of a robot's personality, in my opinion. I'm guessing here, but we'll have to see. That would make sense, and it would explain why not all of them do. As to other companions and other people, we don't really know because we don't know a great deal about them. We know we can hire people to be at our outposts, our bases, and do jobs there. What kind of relationship we might have with those, we don't know yet, but it'd be interesting to see. It looks also like we'll hire people to do work on our ship, maybe possibly as well. There were some shots back in June where you saw NPCs in a spaceship, and it looks like it's probably the player's spaceship. Almost certainly. So what's going to go on there, that'd be interesting. But it seems like this sort of relationship stuff's geared towards primary characters you interact with. So it might be certain faction NPCs as well will respond to what you're doing. But in terms of having a relationship with people, it's likely to be more companion-centric. But that's interesting. Giving it a more realistic, lifelike sort of vibe is very, very cool. So yeah, the other thing he said about it was he didn't want to oversell this particular feature, which is interesting as well. He's kind of holding off on it a little bit. And I think the idea there is that it's a smaller part of the larger dynamic. You know, it's a temporary thing. You do something, you upset them, they act upset with you for a while, then they stop. It's not going to be every NPC doing that because they're already on massive amounts of dialogue. The more variations and things like that you put in, the bigger and bigger and bigger it gets. It snowballs, you know, and there are practicality limits. Somebody you might only talk to once is probably not going to have that kind of reaction. Somebody you're involved with all the time, maybe a bit more. But it's a transient thing, so, you know, I don't know, shoot somebody in the street, they're not very happy about it. For a while, maybe they get over it and move on. Okay, that's maybe not the best example, but after a little while, they'll kind of move back into being okay with you again. So it's not a massive, overarching, game-changing thing, but it's a smaller segment of a thing that brings a bit more life and realism and immersion into the game. So a small-ish focused thing. So quite cool. So planets were another interesting topic that they talked about. Obviously, we know there's going to be about 100 star systems with about 1,000 planets that you can land on and explore on it. Obviously, there's been a lot of chatter about whether or not those are going to be all busy, whether they're not. Bethesda have been pretty straight up about this. They've basically said there is a core storyline, and branching out from that, obviously, side quests, stuff like that. And these primary areas, primary star systems, primary planets, stuff like that, are very much more handcrafted, detailed, and there's more going on them. Whereas many of the other ones, where there are few, if any, people, and there's less going on, they will be more procedural. There'll be less interactability with people and stuff like that. There might be enemies to encounter and creatures and things like that you might have to fight off if you're exploring them. There'll be resources to gather and things like that, but there'll be a comparatively empty and lonely thing. They've talked about how they sort of developed this system, which is quite interesting, how they're able to make so many planets. Basically, the idea being lots and lots of smaller tile sets. So, you know, maybe a square kilometre of terrain that is custom built, and lots of those in different styles that the game can then put those together in different ways and then wrap them around a ball to make a planet and sort of smooth them together to make them flow together, and that sort of thing is the sort of procedural generation basis of making 1,000 planets. Apparently the reason for going for around about 1,000 is it's a lot, it's enough that it's going to feel big and there's tons to explore. But Bethesda can still kind of keep a little bit hands-on with that, which is quite cool. So they will be going in and checking things and touching on things and tweaking here and there on probably all of the planets, and we'll have done. But if it's 10,000 or 100,000, that gets to be very, very impossible very, very quickly. In this case, they can all be named, they can all have a little bit of uniqueness to them, and they can all have cool systems going on them. So you've got things like, if you head down to a planet, maybe it's an empty moon or something like that. I mean, this is kind of echoing the experience you'd get if you went into space on your own in our solar system and went and landed on Pluto. You'd be rather empty and alone, and there'd be nothing going on, but you might be able to look out and see stuff that you couldn't from Earth. Or if you landed on one of Jupiter's moons, for example, you'd have a dead moon with not a lot going on, maybe some interesting rock formations, maybe some geysers or something like that, maybe underground frozen ocean, something like that. And you'd also see Jupiter hanging up in the sky above your head. Things like that are where they're going for the more procedural, less populous planets. Whereas obviously the other side of things, which will be more to a lot of people's taste, is where people are, it's where settlements are, it's where the stories are. that sort of thing is a different vibe. But yeah, it's interesting to hear how they put that together and how they were able to make such a large number of things. It means that, technically speaking, there's no ceiling to how many planets they can make, because the systems can literally just generate as many different worlds as they like with the information that's plugged into them. See, the more they go, the bigger the number, the more likely for duplication. So good that they've kind of capped it to avoid too much of that. But it allows them to create a lot of interesting worlds and still have a little bit hands-on with everything, so they won't be completely feeling like they're computer generated. They should feel like they're somewhat crafted worlds, which is interesting, even if they are quieter and there's less going on, and they're more like, well, like genuinely exploring other planets would be. So, interesting thing to hear about. Yeah, Todd's talked about a lot, as I said, like if you landed on Moon and saw Jupiter over your head. The environmental experience was what he was talking about as being the goal with a lot of these less populous planets. So, yeah, not for everybody. Not everybody's cup of tea. That's fair. Some people will definitely want to stick to the more populous, handcrafted, story-centric areas. But you can go out there. They're great for crafting resources. You can create outposts and bases that are maybe off the beaten track, and you can enjoy the environment, which is kind of the road they wanted to go down with some of this stuff. And it makes a lot of sense, obviously. There's putting a story in, on the other hand, that, say, touched every single one of 1,000 planets. You'd end up with a game that felt really artificially long. So that wouldn't be great. Going the other way makes a lot of sense, and it means you can kind of go off and do your own thing if you want to, and then you can come back to where everybody else is living their lives as well. So yeah, that's quite cool. So one of the other interesting things about planets and stuff like that is to do with difficulty levels. As with other Bethesda games, where you go and when you go there is not conditional on your level, but it's sort of worth taking under advisement. If we look at Fallout 4, you start out in Vault 111. It's right up in the northwest corner of the map, and that sort of section up around there with Sanctuary and Concord and stuff, that's a low-level area, and the further out you come from there, the more dangerous it gets, and the more likely you are to run into higher-level enemies. Same thing's going to kind of apply with Starfield, but it's on a star system basis, so you jump into a system. This one will probably tell you on the map somewhere that it may be geared towards a certain level range, so you might jump in and it's like, oh, by the way, you know how you're level 10? Yeah, the enemies around here are likely to be level 40, so maybe you want to hop back out again and come back later. I mean, you don't have to, you can go crazy and try it if you want, but that's basically how they're going to deal with things on a difficulty basis, which is fairly standard. A lot of games do that. The areas around where you start, they're lower level, and as you progress outwards, they get more and more dangerous, so they're doing that on a system basis in Starfield, which we could have kind of predicted, I think, but that's an interesting little bit of confirmation as to how the difficulty is going to work. Speaking of difficulty, actually, going back to the AI thing again, one of the things Todd Howard was talking about is how their AI they have in their games is capable of being much cleverer and much more dangerous than they make it, which is an interesting observation, because sometimes you see enemies doing stuff that is really a bit thick, and that means they are considerably easier to kill. If it was the other way round, they might well be really clever and lots of ingenuity and possibly absolutely decimate the player. Depends on the player as well. Some people will be more into really smart enemies, some people will be less into it, and they have to strike a balance with that. So that was quite an interesting thing, and I thought was worth a mention. Personally, I would like to have seen a variation on difficulty that instead of pushing up resistances, pushes up enemy intelligence levels in the AI, so it gets harder that way. That's me. But that's not the way Bethesda usually go, and they certainly haven't implied it's the way they've gone here, so I'm guessing it probably isn't. In fact, he hasn't talked about this sort of thing at all. So their difficulty settings will likely be as per previous games, but it's an interesting thing to know the AI is capable of more than they let it do. And the reason for that basically is because it stops being fun at a certain point when the enemies are overly crazy clever and basically way too dangerous for it to be fun. It stops being fun if you can't win, you know? I mean, for me, I like the challenge, so I want to be threatened by enemies, particularly in combat, you know? I want them to be dangerous. I don't want them to be a complete walkover. But, you know, if there's no possibility of winning, then that's not fun either, so a balance to be struck. But I thought the observation was quite an interesting one. So character creation is a really important part of Starfield and RPGs in general. Obviously, that came up in conversation here. It was a relatively light touch conversation element around character creation, one of the things they were talking about in particular was the philosophy behind that sort of thing. Those who have played Bethesda games for a very long time, particularly Oblivion and earlier, will remember they had a harder class system back then. You were a bit more tied down to what you chose at the start of the game, whereas as time has gone on and they've developed from Fallout 3 and Skyrim and Fallout 4, you're not pigeonholed in that way, and it allows you to be more flexible. And that's something they're leaning into even more with Starfield, apparently. The idea is that what they don't want you to have to do is go back and start again, or they don't want you to feel like you have to, in particular. Inevitably people will, but they don't want you to turn around and go, I've not gone the right road with this character, I'm screwed, I need to start again. They want you to be able to go, okay, this is not the way I want to go, this is not the build I want, something like that. I want to change this in-game. So you'll be able to move your character in different directions as you progress through the game without being tied down to the first decisions you make before you know anything about the game, which is a good thing, I think. Getting sort of 4, 5, 6 hours in and then going, I've got to go and do that again because this doesn't work for me. That's not what they want, and I can see why. It's not the most fun thing ever. It halts your progress, which is not really what they want. So, yeah, as you get into the game, they have touched on this a little bit more, but it's cool to hear more about it, that decisions you make, you'll be able to say, okay, that wasn't good, let's go down this path instead, and evolve your character as you learn more about the world your character exists in. So, that's quite a cool choice, and they've built things into the game to allow you to do that. And he also kind of implied that goes for your character's appearance as well, so if you don't like the way your character looks, or maybe you do when you start and you decide later on this guy needs a beard or whatever, you'll be able to do something about that. And possibly even more extensive remodeling of your character? I don't know. It kind of sounds like that's what he's getting towards, and that'd be really, really cool. Being able to change things in-game and use in-world abilities to do that, that would be very, very cool. Obviously, Skyrim has a face sculptor in Riften, and Fallout 4 has the guy down in the doctor's basement, the doctor there, who will remodel your face for you, which is creepy, but he'll do it nonetheless. So you can change how your character looks part way through the game if you like. I imagine they'll have something similar to that so that you can change your look and appearance. And obviously the skill system is somewhat dynamic and fluid, and you're not tied down to a specific thing if you decide the things you've chosen are not the way you want to go in future. So very, very cool. Definitely good to know that you're not tied in, you don't have to restart, and you can move your character into areas that suit your playstyle as you progress through the game without having to necessarily start over if you change your mind, which is cool. So yeah, that's the big Starfield stuff that they've talked about here, and yeah, I found it really, really interesting, really cool to dive into. There's whole bundles of other stuff in here about, there's touching on ideas around Elder Scrolls and Elder Scrolls 6 and the stuff they've done in the past. So if you're interested in watching this interview, grab a cup of tea, put your feet up, whatever. It's long, but it's really, really cool to get into the mindset. So, as I said before, links down below if you want to check it out. I was going to mention earlier, actually, but I've forgotten, so I guess I'm mentioning it now. The major reason you'll have noticed I've shown clips from it, but I haven't really dived into like showing the actual dialogue, the conversation. And the major reason for that is it's kind of copyright. There's also kind of the spirit of the thing with the copyright as well. I don't want to kind of devalue the original interview and stuff and sort of tread on toes, that sort of thing. I want to be respectful of the work that the original creator here has done. So hence why the link is down below and why you can see bits of it and see what was going on. But the conversation, if you want the original conversation, head on over there and show the support to the person who did the work, basically, is the mindset I'm going for. So I was going to touch on that earlier, but yeah, I forgot. Alongside Starfield, as I say, and Elder Scrolls, there is some conversations around what's coming up. There's a little talk about the Indiana Jones game that Machine Games are working on, and Todd Howard is executive producer on. Again, not a lot of details. Apparently, it is very much an Indiana Jones game, and Todd Howard described it as a love letter to the Indiana Jones movies. So I would take that to mean they're doing their best to bring Indiana Jones from the screen to video games, and you can kind of embrace everything that is. But we'll have to wait and see until nearer the time, because it'll be a while before they share more on that. I wouldn't expect to hear much more probably before 2024 on that, but it's cool to hear him talking about it on occasion. There's a little bit of conversation around the Fallout TV show in there, which is cool. For example, he's talking about how, as opposed to anything else, they decided to create a new story in the Fallout universe. So this is very much character-driven. It's focused on this group of people and their story in the wasteland of Fallout. rather than sort of retelling an existing story, it's something new, which is cool. But again, they didn't share too much in detail and stuff. They've talked about the attention to detail that has been shown in the series, and we've kind of seen that with some of the leaks and the set shots that have come out and stuff. The props and the environments and stuff, they are really, really good. So definitely looking forward to seeing that, and the attention to detail looks like it's definitely going to be there. That's scheduled for release sometime later on next year. At the rate things are going, it's certainly not going to be before the second half of next year. I'm guessing probably about a year from now. But nonetheless, looking forward to finding out about that, and a little chatter on that was interesting. And last but not least, only mentioned in flying passing, Bethesda are working on a new mobile game. They kind of touched on mobile games in general very briefly, but apparently Bethesda have a new one that they have been working on for a while, that they are working on, and that will be out at some point. It's unannounced at the moment, so don't expect it anytime soon, but unsurprisingly, Todd Howard saying how positive things about it, because of course he is, but yeah, that is a thing. So as to what it might be, seems likely it might be related to Starfield, or it might be something completely new, because they've already got a Fallout one, they've already got an Elder Scrolls one. Doing something else makes sense. So who knows? Pure speculation, but they haven't even announced its existence apart from this passing remark here, so we'll have to see what that ends up being, but that's very, very cool too. So, enough of me rabbiting on. I do hope you found this interesting little touch on some of the cool details on what's coming up in Starfield. I will, as I say, be keeping a close eye on the Game Awards next week and seeing what's happening with that. That's scheduled for next Thursday, so if there's any cool news about that, or Starfield stuff, which I'm imagining we'll get a little bit, I will be all over that. So definitely notification bell if you want to catch that and keep an eye out for it. So we'll be continuing to cover Starfield between now and its launch, and we will be jumping in with both feet when that game eventually comes out. So yeah, very much looking forward to that, and we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and in the early part of next year in particular is when I'm really curious about, because yeah, that's when I think things are going to start picking up a bit. But on that note, thank you very much for watching. Hope you found this interesting and informative. Do check out the original interview, as I say, links down below. If you like the video, please do drop subs, likes, all that good stuff. It really helps out. Very much appreciated. Do check out some of the Fallout stuff and some of the live streams we're doing as well. There's a lot of fun stuff happening, so have a little poke around the channel. I really appreciate it. There's cool stuff in there, and a whole lot of extra Starfield stuff that will have been somewhere up here if you want to check that out as well. So, thank you very much for watching. I very much appreciate, and I will be speaking to you all very, very soon.